You know, they always say wars cost a ton of money, right? But nobody told you about the invisible bill. Before 1694, before the Bank of England, before modern finance, governments fought wars using methods that seemed free. They weren't. They just hid the price where you couldn't see it until it was too late. A Roman soldier's salary doubled. Your bread now costs 3 times more. Nobody connected the dots. And once you see what really happened, you can't unsee it. For centuries, rulers discovered the same dark secret. You can fight a war today and make someone else pay tomorrow. Welcome to the Wealth Timeline, where money, power, and history quietly shape the world around us. This is the story of what happened when empires went to war without banks to fund them. The consequences are still teaching us lessons. Picture Europe in 1618. No stock markets, no central banks, no government bonds. 80% of people worked the land. The entire concept of national debt as we know it didn't exist yet. When a king needed to raise an army, he had 4 options. Tax his people directly, force wealthy merchants to loan him money, reduce the precious metal in his coins, or simply take what he needed from conquered enemies. These weren't sophisticated financial instruments. They were desperate measures dressed as policy. At the time, this seemed reasonable. You need soldiers. Soldiers need pay. You find the money wherever you can. What no one noticed was the cost, not the announced cost, the hidden one that would surface years later as empty markets, abandoned farms, and populations that simply disappeared from the record. The system began under real pressure, existential war. In ancient Rome, military spending consumed up to 80% of the state budget by 150 CE. When you're defending borders that stretch from Britain to Mesopotamia, you don't have the luxury of fiscal restraint. The Emperor Nero faced this reality after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Rebuilding a capital while funding distant wars required creative solutions. So, he did what seemed logical. He reduced the silver content in the denarius from 100% under Augustus to 93.5%. More coins, same metal. The soldiers got paid. The wars continued. What decision-makers believed at the time was that this was a manageable accounting adjustment. Metal is metal. Value is what the state declares it to be. As long as everyone accepts the coin, the system functions. The documented assumption that later proved dangerous, that you could print your way out of a resource shortage without consequence. That inflation, a term they didn't even have yet, would remain invisible long enough for the immediate crisis to pass. It worked, but only under conditions that would not last. The system expanded because it delivered results. By the 2nd century CE, Roman military spending had surged from 273 million sesterces annually under Augustus to 900 million under later emperors. Soldiers' pay increased from 1,200 to 2,000 sesterces per year under Septimius Severus. The legions stayed loyal. The borders held. In medieval England, during the 100 Years' War, kings borrowed from Italian banking families like the Bardi and Peruzzi. Merchants gained legitimacy. Rulers gained immediate liquidity. Both sides believed they'd found sustainable partnership. Each success introduced a side effect the system wasn't designed to handle. Roman currency debasement created what economists now call a Cantillon Effect. New money entered circulation through military wages first, benefiting soldiers and suppliers, while fixed-income citizens watched prices rise before their own earnings adjusted. The temporary solution became permanent practice. By the mid-3rd century, the denarius contained just 50% silver. Medieval loan systems worked beautifully until they didn't. When England's Edward III defaulted in the 1340s, the Bardi and Peruzzi banking houses, pillars of Florence's economy, collapsed overnight. The short-term stability of credit became long-term financial contagion. The stronger it became, the harder it was to stop. The first signs of strain appeared in the numbers nobody was tracking. In Rome, annual inflation crept to 0.7%, modest by modern standards, but unprecedented in an agrarian economy where prices had remained stable for generations. Trade slowed. Provinces that once enriched the empire now barely covered their own defense costs. Ignored warnings came from the periphery. In the 3rd century CE, frontier regions began reverting to barter as debased currency lost credibility. Merchants demanded payment in goods rather than coins. The monetary system was fragmenting, but Rome's central administration was too focused on immediate military threats to notice. Medieval Europe showed similar patterns. During the 100 Years' War, both England and France dramatically increased taxation. Wool taxes, land taxes, emergency levies. In 1381, England's poll tax sparked the Peasants' Revolt. In France, devastated regions saw agricultural output collapse, but war expenses only increased. The institutional blind spot was simple. Authorities measured success by battles won, not by economic foundations eroding beneath them. During the 30 Years' War, Sweden placed 60% of royal tax revenue in private hands to raise immediate funds by pawning crown lands. Spain went bankrupt in 1627 and again in 1647, yet somehow continued fighting. France's war debt reached 38 million livres by 1640. Nothing collapsed. And that was the problem. The system limped forward, accumulating damage that wouldn't be fully visible until decades after the treaties were signed. The 30 Years' War represented the exact moment the old system revealed its limits. Between 1618 and 1648, up to one-third of Germany's population disappeared. Casualties, disease, famine, flight, not ancient history, not distant memory, within a single generation. Half of urban populations vanished in affected regions. Up to 50% of national incomes went directly to war. Spain's Philip IV spent 13 million ducats annually on military operations, while his kingdom went bankrupt twice. France's Cardinal Richelieu watched debt service consume increasing portions of revenue even as he expanded the war. Sweden's Gustavus Adolphus financed campaigns by selling copper and iron, depleting resources faster than they could regenerate. Why did it seem reasonable? Because each leader believed the alternative was worse. Surrender meant losing sovereignty. Continued fighting meant maybe, possibly, eventually winning enough to make it all worthwhile. The decision that changed everything wasn't a single treaty or declaration. It was the collective realization, expressed gradually in the Peace of Westphalia negotiations, that this method of war financing had reached its absolute limit. From this point on, the outcome was no longer optional. Either European powers would develop new financial systems, or they would tear themselves apart trying to fund the next war. Who benefited? Those who received new money first: military contractors, grain suppliers, landowners with resources to sell. The Cantillon Effect ensured that inflation enriched those closest to the source while destroying those furthest from it. Peasants on fixed rents, urban workers with static wages, anyone whose wealth existed in saved coins rather than productive assets. Who absorbed the cost? Everyone else, across generations. German cities that took a century to recover their pre-war populations. Spanish taxpayers servicing debt from wars their grandparents fought. English merchants navigating bankruptcies, cascading through Italian banking networks. Power quietly shifted in two directions. First, toward whoever could access credit. Merchants gained political influence by becoming indispensable to war-making states. Second, toward centralization. The fiscal chaos of the 30 Years' War accelerated the rise of absolute monarchies in France and Prussia, where concentrated authority could theoretically impose fiscal discipline. The pattern was consistent. Short-term military needs were met, but long-term economic depression followed. Rome's 3rd century crisis. England and France's post-100 Years' War stagnation. Germany's urban decline lasting generations after 1648. The data speaks clearly. In Spain, 7.5 million of 15 million ducats in 1628 went to debt service, half the budget paying for past wars while current wars continued. The opportunity cost was infrastructure never built, trade routes never developed, innovations never funded. History doesn't repeat events, it repeats incentives. The specific mechanisms have changed. We have government bonds now, central banks, sophisticated debt markets. But the underlying pattern remains historically documented. War expenses are easier to hide than to pay for. Modern governments mask costs through deficit spending, currency creation, and intergenerational transfers. The tools are more refined, but the principle is identical to Roman debasement or Spanish bankruptcies. Make future populations pay for present wars. The Cantillon Effect still operates. Those closest to new money, defense contractors, financial institutions, early recipients, gain disproportionate benefit. Those furthest away absorb inflation's costs without seeing the cause. What changed after 1694 with the Bank of England wasn't human nature. It was the sophistication of the illusion. Modern systems can sustain debt loads that would have shattered ancient empires, but that does not mean the costs disappeared. They just became more complex to trace. Two takeaways matter. About systems. The infrastructure of war finance shapes who wins and who pays more than battlefield tactics ever do. Rome didn't fall to barbarians. It fell to currency debasement that made defending itself economically impossible. About human behavior, we consistently choose to make others pay for our immediate needs, whether we're 3rd century emperors or 21st century voters. The mechanism changes. The incentive doesn't. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon, because the next story might just change how you see power itself. The patterns are already repeating. The question is whether you'll recognize them